He snapped my arm. Those 4 words, barely a whisper, barely audible over the hiss of a coffee machine, changed everything. If you've ever had someone show up for you when the whole world walked away, this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Stay with me all the way to the end. Subscribe to the channel, hit that bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The diner was called Patty's Place. It had been sitting on the edge of Route 12 outside Black Creek, Montana for 31 years, and in those 31 years, not much had changed. The same cracked red vinyl on the booth seats, the same hand-painted sign above the register that said, "God bless America," and good tippers. The same faint smell of burnt coffee and pancake syrup that soaked into everything, the walls, the curtains, even the uniforms the waitresses wore. Most mornings, Patty's Place was a quiet kind of alive. Truckers coming through, ranchers stopping in before a long day, a few retirees who had nowhere better to be and liked it that way. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where nobody asked too many questions, and where the news traveled faster than the Wi-Fi signal, which wasn't saying much because the Wi-Fi barely worked at all. On a Tuesday morning in late September, the breakfast rush had thinned out to almost nothing. 2 ranchers sat at the counter finishing their eggs. An older woman in a floral blouse was nursing her 3rd cup of coffee near the window. The young waitress, a girl named Deb, who was working her way through community college, was refilling sugar dispensers behind the counter and half listening to the country radio station playing low from the kitchen. Nobody was paying attention to the door. That was why nobody noticed her come in. She didn't slam the door. She didn't stomp in with the kind of entrance that turns heads. She just appeared. One moment the door was closed. The next it was slowly pulling shut behind a woman who moved like she was trying not to be seen. Like every step was a calculation, like she had learned somewhere along the way that walking too loud attracted the wrong kind of attention. She was in her mid-30s, blonde hair pulled back without ceremony, wearing a denim jacket over a plain gray shirt. She looked like she could have been anyone. A traveler passing through, someone visiting family, a woman who just needed coffee and a moment of quiet. Deb looked up automatically, the habit of a waitress, always clocking who came through the door, and opened her mouth to say, "Sit anywhere you like," which was what she always said. But the words didn't come out, because something stopped her. It took Deb a second to identify what it was. The woman wasn't bleeding, she wasn't crying. Her face was composed, controlled, the kind of control that comes not from calm, but from practice, from learning how to arrange your expression so that nobody asked questions. But Deb had grown up in a house where she'd learned to read rooms fast, learned to read people faster, and something in the way this woman held herself, one arm, very slightly drawn in toward her body, one shoulder a fraction lower than the other, movements that were just barely too careful, made the hair on the back of Deb's neck stand up. "Anywhere is fine," Deb said finally, her voice coming out softer than usual. The woman chose the booth farthest from the door, the one tucked against the back wall where the light was poorest and you could see every entrance from where you sat. She slid in facing outward. Old habit, maybe, or something newer than habit, something learned the hard way. "Just coffee," she said when Deb came over. "Black." "Sure thing." Deb set the menu down anyway. "You want a minute?" The woman looked at the menu, then she looked up at Deb, and for just a fraction of a second her composure slipped. It was barely anything, a flicker, the tightening around the eyes, a breath that came just a half beat too late. Then it was gone, sealed back behind that careful face. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I'll take a minute." Her name was Emily Carter. In the world of the Hells Angels, names meant something. They carried weight, history, reputation. Emily Carter had earned hers the slow way, not through spectacle, not through connection, but through years of showing up, following through, and standing her ground when standing her ground cost her something. She'd patched in through a chapter that had seen more than its share of hard years, and she'd proven herself in the ways that actually mattered. She was reliable, she was loyal, and she did not scare easily. The brothers and sisters in her chapter had learned to trust her instincts, the way you trust someone who has never once given you a reason not to. She was not a woman who asked for help. That was the first thing Jack had ever said about her back when he'd first met her at a regional gathering almost 8 years ago. He'd watched her fix a blown tire on a brother's bike in the rain, refusing every offer of assistance, hands steady, not a single complaint. He'd watched her talk down a situation at a bar that was 60 seconds from becoming something that would have landed 3 people in a hospital and himself in a jail cell. He'd watched her over the years that followed navigate situations that would have broken people twice her size. She was not a woman who asked for help. That was why when the phone rang in Jack Iron Wolf Harrison's house at 7:22 on a Tuesday morning and the name on the screen said E. Carter, he answered it on the first ring. Not because it was unusual for Emily to call. They talked a few times a month the way old friends do, checking in, exchanging information, occasionally venting about the particular frustrations of a life lived outside the ordinary. But there was something that reached through the phone before she even spoke. A quality to the silence on the other end. The kind of silence that had weight to it. Emily. He didn't make it a question. He just said her name. Steady, present, an anchor thrown without knowing yet what it needed to hold. Her voice came through barely above a whisper. Jack. One word. Just his name. But the way she said it, the way it came out with those 3 additional pounds of something she was fighting to contain, he was already straightening in his chair, already putting his coffee down, already giving her his full attention with the kind of focus that comes from years of learning when something is serious. I'm here, he said. Talk to me. Talk to. There was a pause. He heard her breathing, controlled, deliberate, the breathing of someone managing themselves very carefully, the way you manage yourself when breaking down is not an option. And you've been holding it together so long, you've forgotten what it felt like not to. She stopped, started again. I need to tell you something. Okay. Another pause. He snapped my arm. The diner noise in the background filtered through. Coffee machine, low radio, the ambient sound of an ordinary morning that had nothing to do with what she had just said. Jack did not react. Not outwardly. He had learned in decades of dealing with situations that required steadiness, that the worst thing you could do in the first moment of hard news was make it about your reaction. So he held himself still inside and out and let her words land and let them mean what they meant without flinching away from it. How long ago, he asked. Few weeks. Where are you now? Patty's Place, Black Creek. He knew the town. He had ridden through it twice years back. Small, isolated. The kind of place where everybody's business was, everybody's business except apparently when it wasn't. Are you safe right now? A pause that lasted one breath too long. For now. He registered everything that lived in those 2 words. The for now that acknowledged that safe was a temporary condition rather than a permanent one. The for now that told him she wasn't sure, couldn't be sure, was operating on vigilance instead of security. Who, he asked. She told him. The name landed in the silence of his kitchen like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples that spread outward from it were not small ones. Jack said nothing for 3 full seconds, which for Jack Harrison was a long time. Then very quietly he said, I'm coming. Jack, you don't have to. I'm coming, Emily. The certainty in his voice wasn't the kind that invited argument. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't loud. It was simply the sound of a decision already made, the kind of decision that doesn't require deliberation, because it comes from a place so fundamental that thinking about it would be redundant. Okay, she said. Her voice cracked on the single syllable. Just barely. Just for a moment. Then it was sealed back behind the composure again. I'll call you when I'm an hour out, he said. Okay. Emily. Yeah. You did the right thing calling. Silence. Then I wasn't sure anybody would. She stopped herself. I know, he said. I'm coming. He ended the call, sat still for exactly 4 seconds, and then began to puff. Jack Harrison was 61 years old. He had ridden motorcycles for 43 of those years, had been a Hells Angel for 31 of them, and had spent the last decade as what the younger members called an OGA designation that carried, depending on who used it, and how, either reverence or impatience. Jack had long since stopped caring which. He had a face that looked like it had been carved out of something harder than most things, not cruel, but weathered, the kind of face that had spent decades outdoors and in difficult rooms and had arrived at a particular quality of stillness that some people mistook for coldness. People who knew him knew the difference. People who didn't know him sometimes found out the hard way. He had been married once. His daughter called him on holidays, and sometimes in between, and those calls were the best parts of his life, though he would not have been particularly comfortable with saying that out loud to anyone. He lived alone in a house outside of Billings that was modest by any standard, but suited him entirely. He had a dog named Clarence who was elderly and imperious, and who watched Jack pack his bag that Tuesday morning with the expression of an animal that had seen this before. "I'll call Renee to come check on you," Jack told Clarence. Clarence stared at him. "Don't look at me like that." Clarence continued looking at him like that. Jack grabbed his jacket. The vest went over it, the one with 31 years of patches and pins in the worn leather smell. That was by this point as much a part of him as his own skin. And he walked to the garage and he looked at his bike and he ran one hand along the handlebar, the way some people touch the shoulder of a friend before something difficult. It was a 420-mile ride to Black Creek. He was on the road in 17 minutes. The thing about distance when you're angry is that it doesn't actually help as much as people think it does. People have this idea that riding or driving or running or any of the physical things people do when they're carrying something too heavy somehow metabolizes the weight, burns it off, gives it somewhere to go. And maybe for some feelings that's true. But grief that comes from a specific kind of outrage, the kind that lives at the intersection of loyalty and helplessness, doesn't burn off. It clarifies. Every mile of flat Montana highway Jack put behind him that morning, the picture got sharper. He had known about Ryan Maddox. You couldn't operate in that world in that region without knowing about Ryan Maddox. The man went by Crusher, a name that had been assigned somewhere along the line, and that he had done nothing to discourage because men like that understand the value of a name that makes people think twice. He ran a crew that operated in the gray spaces between legal and not outlaw enough to attract serious federal attention, not clean enough to operate in daylight, but powerful enough in the local ecology that most people who might have been inclined to push back simply didn't. He was the kind of man who collected power through other people's fear, who understood in the way that particular type of person always understands that the most efficient way to maintain control is not to be the most violent person in the room, but to make sure everyone in the room believes you might be. It's a performance mostly. But performances are powerful when everyone agrees to treat them as real. Jack had heard things about Crusher over the years, nothing that had risen to the level of direct confrontation, nothing that had come close enough to touch people he cared about. Until now, until Emily. He thought about her voice on the phone, the specific quality of that whisper, not soft because she was gentle, but soft because she was containing something. He thought about few weeks, meaning she had been sitting with a broken arm, and everything else that came with what had happened for weeks before she called. He thought about what it took for a woman like Emily Carter to be sitting alone in a diner booth at 7 in the morning, nursing a coffee, making a phone call that she'd clearly been afraid to make. What it took, he thought, what it cost. He pushed the bike faster. Back at Patty's place, Deb came back with the coffee, and this time she just sat down across from Emily in the booth. It was not standard waitress protocol. Patty had a list of rules about not fraternizing during service hours, about maintaining professional boundaries, about keeping your personal opinions to yourself when you were wearing the uniform. Deb was aware of all of these rules. She sat down anyway. Emily looked at her. "My break technically started 2 minutes ago," Deb said with a small, completely unconvincing attempt at casualness. Emily said nothing, but something shifted in her expression, not softening, exactly more like the very faint acknowledgement that she'd noticed. "You don't have to talk," Deb said. I'm just sitting here." The two women sat across from each other in the back booth of Patty's place, and the country radio played something low and familiar from the kitchen. And outside the window, the September light was doing that particular Montana thing, where it comes in at an angle and makes everything look like it's made of gold. After a long moment, Emily looked down at the coffee cup in her hands. Her left hand was wrapped around it normally. Her right arm rested on the table at a slightly wrong angle, supported, carefully held at a position that minimized pain rather than one that looked natural. "I called someone," Emily said finally, not explaining, just saying it. "Good," said Deb. Another silence. "He said he's coming." Deb looked at her. "Good," she said again. Emily looked up from the coffee. There was something in her eyes that was difficult to look at directly. Not weakness, not helplessness, but something rawer and more complicated. The specific expression of someone who has been carrying something alone for long enough that the simple act of another person sitting across from them is almost too much. "I wasn't sure anyone would," Emily said quietly. Deb didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't a good one, so she didn't offer a bad one. "He said I did the right thing calling," Emily continued, and the way she said it, slow, careful, like she was testing the weight of the sentence, suggested she wasn't sure yet whether she believed it. "Did it feel right?" Deb asked. Emily thought about that for a long moment. Terrifying, she said. That's not the same as wrong, said Deb. For the first time since she walked through the door, the woman across the booth looked almost like she might cry. But she didn't. She held it the way that she held everything, with that quiet, ferocious discipline that was in its own way one of the loneliest things Deb had ever seen. He'll be here in a few hours, Emily said. Then you've got a few hours, said Deb. You want anything to eat? Emily looked at the menu she hadn't touched. Yeah, she said quietly. Actually, yeah, I do. It was while Emily was eating eggs, wheat toast, orange juice, the first real meal she'd had, in longer than she wanted to think about, that the door to Patty's place opened again. She didn't look up immediately. She had positioned herself to see the entrance without appearing to watch it, which meant she clocked every person who came through in her peripheral vision. 2 men she recognized as locals who came in every Tuesday for the special. A woman she didn't know. A teenage kid who looked like he was skipping school and trying to pretend he wasn't. And then a man who made her fork stop moving. He was in his 40s, big through the shoulders, wearing a flannel shirt that was too clean for someone who'd been working outside. He had the kind of face that had practiced the expression of casual indifference so many times that it had hardened into something almost convincing. Almost. Emily had been in enough rooms with enough people who used their size as language to know the difference between a man who was simply large and a man who was using his largeness as a statement. This man was doing the latter. Every step he took was calibrated. Every movement said, I am here, and you should know I am here. He did not look directly at her. That was the thing that made her chest tighten. He didn't look at her the way a stranger doesn't look at a stranger, which is to say with the natural indifference of someone who has no reason to be interested. He didn't look at her the way a person avoids eye contact in a public space. He didn't look at her the way someone who genuinely hadn't noticed her would not look at her. He didn't look at her the way a person doesn't look at something they're very specifically watching. Her hand moved slowly under the table. Old reflex, old training. She registered the time on the clock above the counter, 9:14, and calculated. Jack had said he'd call when he was an hour out. He'd left approximately 90 minutes ago. He was still hours away. Deb came back around to refill her coffee and caught Emily's expression and had the good sense to very quietly position herself between Emily and the man who had come in a gesture that was both useless in any practical sense and deeply meaningful for reasons that had nothing to do with practicality. You know him? Deb asked, voice barely audible. He knows Crusher, Emily said. Deb's face did something complicated. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, you sit right there. I'm not going anywhere, Emily said, and the steadiness in her own voice surprised her. She had said it the way Jack might say it, the way someone who had made a decision said things. She was not going anywhere. She had made a phone call. She had done the right thing, and now she was going to sit in this booth in this diner with her coffee and her carefully held arm and her very deliberate composure, and she was going to wait. Because for the first time in several weeks, there was something to wait for. The man in the flannel shirt sat at the counter 3 stools from the end and ordered coffee without looking at the menu and did not once look directly at Emily Carter. And Emily Carter ate her eggs and drank her orange juice and breathed steadily and waited. Outside, somewhere on a long Montana highway, the sound of a single motorcycle engine moved steadily through the morning air, getting closer. The man in the flannel shirt ordered his coffee and didn't drink it. That was the first thing Emily noticed. He wrapped both hands around the mug, the way people do when they want to look comfortable, when they want to look like they belong somewhere. But the coffee stayed full. Steam rose off it, thin, disappeared, and he just sat there, hands around a cup he never lifted, eyes pointed at the counter in front of him with the specific blank focus of a man who was listening very hard to something that wasn't the radio. Emily took a slow breath. She cut her toast in half, picked up one piece, and took a bite she didn't taste. Normal. Ordinary, just a woman eating breakfast. She had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do in front of a man like that was let him see that you were afraid. Not because fear was weakness. She had stopped believing that particular lie years ago, but because certain kinds of men fed on visible fear the way fire feeds on oxygen. You gave them that, you gave them power they hadn't earned yet. So she chewed her toast and she breathed and she kept her right arm still against the table and she thought. Deb had moved to the far end of the counter and was doing something with a stack of napkins that didn't actually need doing. She kept glancing up. Emily appreciated that more than she could have explained. Her phone was face down on the table. She turned it over, opened the messages, typed quickly with her left hand. Someone here. Think he's one of Crusher's. Don't think he's going to do anything in public. Just letting you know. She hit send and turned the phone back over. 40 seconds later, a reply from Jack. Don't move, I'm making calls. She read it twice. Making calls. She knew what that meant. She'd seen Jack work a phone before. The quiet efficiency of it, the way information moved through a network of people who had learned to trust each other through years of shared history. He was not coming alone into this blind. He was already building the picture. She turned the phone back face down and picked up the other half of her toast. The man at the counter shifted on his stool. Emily didn't look up, but she heard it, the small adjustment, the creak of vinyl, the minute change in the ambient weight of the room that happens when a person redirects their attention. And she understood with the clarity of someone who had spent years reading exactly these kinds of signals that she had maybe 3 hours before Jack arrived, and that those 3 hours were not going to be entirely comfortable. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known yet, sitting in that back booth with her eggs and her careful posture, was that the man on the stool was not there to threaten her. He was there because he was afraid of Crusher too. And he was trying to figure out whether she was someone he could talk to. That particular truth was still about 40 minutes away. In the meantime, Emily ate her breakfast and waited, which was the hardest thing she had done in a very long time, including the night her arm was broken. Waiting, she had discovered, was its own particular kind of courage. The clock above the counter moved to 9:28. Outside, the sound of a truck passing on Route 12 came and went. The man at the counter finally lifted his coffee. He turned just slightly and for the first time looked directly at Emily Carter. She looked back. Neither of them spoke, but something shifted in his face, something small and involuntary, the kind of micro-expression that a person can't fully control because it comes from somewhere deeper than performance. She had expected wariness. She had expected hostility, the blank professional look of someone doing a job. She had expected a dozen things. She had not expected that. She had not expected to see guilt. The man looked back at his coffee. Emily set down her toast. Her mind was moving fast now, recalibrating, running back through everything she knew and laying this new information against it. Guilt meant presence. Guilt meant he had been there or close enough to there to have something to feel guilty about. Guilt meant he had watched or known or had the ability to have done something he hadn't done. Guilt in her particular experience meant a witness. She thought about Jack's message, making calls. She thought about what she knew about Crusher's operation, about the way he held his people together, not through loyalty, which you had to earn, but through obligation and fear, which you only had to maintain. Men like that built organizations that looked solid from the outside, but were fundamentally brittle at their core, because every person inside them was only there because leaving felt more dangerous than staying. Until something changed the math. The man was still staring at his coffee. Emily made a decision. She picked up her mug and her phone, and she stood up, and she walked to the counter, and she sat down 2 stools from the man in the flannel shirt. Not right next to him, that would have been a pressure he might have bolted from. 2 stools, close enough to talk without broadcasting it to the room. Far enough to give him the fiction of a choice. He didn't look at her. I'm not going to pretend I don't know who you are, she said quietly. His jaw tightened. I don't know who you are, he said. His voice was low, flat, careful. Sure you do, she said. And I'm pretty sure you know why I'm sitting in this diner instead of somewhere else. A pause. The coffee machine behind the counter clicked through a cycle. Deb had retreated to the kitchen, whether by instinct or good judgment, or both. I don't want trouble, the man said. Neither do I, said Emily. I've had enough trouble to last me a while. He finally looked at her. Up close, she could see that he was older than she'd initially placed him, mid-50s maybe, with the particular worn look of someone who had been making difficult choices for a long time and had stopped sleeping well because of it. You called someone, he said. It wasn't a question. I did, she said. He nodded slowly. His hands around the mug tightened, then released. That's going to, he stopped himself. Going to what? She asked. He looked at her. Then he looked at her arm, the way she was holding it, the slight, unnatural angle, the careful stillness of it. And whatever calculation he'd been running in his head, she watched him run the last of it and come to the end. My name is Dale, he said. Emily, she said. I know, said Dale. What Dale told her came out slowly in pieces, the way things come out when a person has been carrying them for a long time and has convinced themselves they couldn't say them and is now discovering that the weight of not saying them has finally become heavier than the risk of speech. He had been with Crusher's crew for 6 years, Not because he'd sought it out, he'd grown up in Black Creek, and Crusher's people had expanded into the region when Dale was at a low point, and it had started with small things, favors, and connections, and the intoxicating sense of being inside something rather than outside it. By the time the small things had become large things, he was in deep enough that the exit wasn't visible anymore. He had been there that night, not behind the warehouse. He hadn't been that close, but close enough. He'd heard the confrontation start. He'd heard when it stopped being a confrontation and became something else. He had not gone in. "Why are you telling me this?" Emily asked. Her voice was steady. She had decided consciously and deliberately not to let the anger that was building behind her sternum reach her voice. Not yet. Not here. Not with this man she was beginning to understand exactly the kind of person who might actually be useful. Dale looked at his hands. "Because I've got a kid," he said. 17, daughter. He paused. "And I keep thinking about what I would want somebody to do if it was her." The diner was quiet around them. The two ranchers at the counter had paid and left. The woman in the floral blouse was still at her window table but had her nose in a book. The morning had slowed to that particular mid-morning stillness. "I've got a kid," Dale repeated, "and I couldn't sleep that night. Couldn't sleep for a week. Couldn't," he stopped. "I'm not saying that makes anything okay. I know it doesn't." "No," Emily said. "It doesn't. I know." "But you're here," she said. He looked at her. "You came here," she said, "to this diner. You sat down, you watched me eat breakfast for half an hour, and worked yourself up to saying something." She paused. "So